Hi, everyone. Welcome to Baden Hill. Baden Hill is a name from history. It was the place of King Arthur's greatest battle. It's actually spelled B-A-D-O-N, but hey, my name is spelled B-A-D-E-N, and we're going to go with that. Baden Hill is a place of aspirations. It's a place that we all have to climb to. In the coming videos, you will discover that there's a whole lot of information that we can learn about history. I try to give you as much information as possible, but at the same time, my goal is to tell a story. And I hope that after watching the videos, you can practice telling the story of each video with someone nearby, someone who will listen, someone that you can teach. Our goal is to share. And in order to share, we have to start with what is closest to us and expand from there. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the city where these videos are made, San Francisco. San Francisco hasn't always been called San Francisco. Its first name was Yerba, Buena, which basically means the good plants or good herb. That was the original name of this settlement that we now call San Francisco. But even when I say original, I have to go back and correct myself because Spanish explorers gave this city its first name in Spanish, but it had a name before then. That name, unfortunately, is not a commonly known name. So let's just focus on the people who were here first as we discuss local history and local government. The Yelamu people were the Native Americans who settled in the peninsula we call the San Francisco Peninsula, and they were a part of what were called the Ohlone Indians, Native Americans, and they were also speakers of a language called the Miwok language. So you had actually the Ohlone people were settled in East Bay, and the Yelamu were the people then who were part of that group that ended up on the peninsula. They sadly were pushed away from their land. And there were about 160 to 300 members of the Yelamu tribe who were here in 1776 when Juan Bautista de Anza arrived with basically the first expedition to San Francisco. So let's talk a little bit about Yerba Buena. Yerba Buena was the name given to the settlement created by de Anza, who was that first explorer in 1776. And two members of his expedition created the mission. And the mission was named Misión San Francisco de Asís. And you can hear the name San Francisco. That was the name of the mission. And San Francisco is St. Francis of Assisi, a famous man who was a strong Christian in the early church, in the medieval church, and he supposedly was able to appreciate nature in very special ways and is seen as a very peaceful man. And so a lot of people appreciate that our city is named for St. Francis of Assisi. So the mission was San Francisco, and the settlement, the town, was Yerba Buena. And Yerba Buena stretched from the Presidio, which was the military outpost today. It was created a little bit later. And it stretched to the mission in the east. So you had the Presidio and the mission, and in between you basically had Yerba Buena. So that was the first San Francisco. And it's important to just kind of realize that San Francisco had a lot of wonderful traits. It was a peninsula. It was, part of this bay, which ships could sail into and be protected. But it wasn't necessarily ideal in every way for a settlement. There was a lot of sand dunes, and marshlands, kind of swampy areas on the coast. And so a lot of work had to be done to create a city where we now have San Francisco. By the way, the plaza of the original Spanish settlement of Yerba Buena is now called Portsmouth Square, and you can go there. You can go visit it. It's in Chinatown, and it's a very interesting place to go. There's a lot of history blended together there. It's named for the ship that came after the war was won between the United States and Mexico, and California and San Francisco were claimed by Americans. Now, 1849 is obviously a very key year for us here in San Francisco. 1849 was the famous year of the gold rush. And because of this rush for gold, San Francisco was the Golden Gate. It was the gateway to the gold fields, and it became a boom town, and it grew like crazy. Now, the leader of the city had been, under the Spanish, had been known as the alcalde. The alcalde was like a mayor, and one of those mayors was John W. Geary. John W. Geary not only served as an alcalde, but once there were enough people in San Francisco and in California for California to become a U.S. state, then John W. Geary was elected as the first mayor of the city. He was a very interesting guy. He started out as a civil engineer working on railroads. He went to college and was well educated. He also studied law. And then he was involved in, he came out to San Francisco, and he became mayor of San Francisco. But later on, he was appointed governor of the Kansas territory. So, he started in Pennsylvania, went to San Francisco, and then he was in Kansas for a while. And he was also involved in the military in Kansas, and he supported Kansas's right to be a free state against those in Missouri who wanted to make it a slave state. And there were people who tried to invade Kansas and burn down the city of Lawrence. And it happened once, and then when it was going to happen again, Geary was the leader who drove off those invaders and basically preserved the identity of Kansas. And it was a time known as Bleeding Kansas, a very difficult time, which we'll touch on in this series of videos and later on too. Eventually, after he had served in Kansas, he went on to serve in Pennsylvania as governor of Pennsylvania. He was a towering figure, 6 feet 6 inches tall, 200 plus pounds. And so, on the battlefield, it was kind of an easy target during the Civil War. But he did fight at Gettysburg, and again, Pennsylvania was kind of always his home. But we remember him here in San Francisco as someone who fought for people's rights. He wasn't necessarily a perfect man. I'm sure we could go back and see that he, had skeletons in his closet. We'll find that with every historical figure. But when we look to Geary Street, hopefully we can think of a man who fought for freedom and for law and order too. Now, the first governor of California was Peter Hardeman Burnett. Peter Hardeman Burnett was someone who had been a farmer, and he settled in Oregon, and he tried to make a living there and wasn't successful. Eventually, he came to California, and when California was really getting going, he became basically a real estate agent, selling land plots near the new city of Sacramento. And he made his name. He got involved in politics, and eventually he became the first elected governor of California. But he was also the first governor to resign. less than about 2 years into his term. And there is a sense that he was not willing to allow African Americans to settle in California. He believed that they would somehow feel that they were less than other people, and basically it's an excuse from making a stand and being courageous about those who had been oppressed and who should have new opportunity in this state. And he also was seen as excluding foreigners, and including the Chinese. So maybe that's why his name has generally been forgotten. Now, the government of San Francisco has always been one that was trying to deal with issues of war and peace. Now, even though San Francisco wasn't a site of the Civil War, many streets are named for Civil War Union leaders. But peace and war are something that are always with us. And during the 1960s, that was a time when the United States was fighting a war in Vietnam, and there were many people who came to San Francisco promoting peace. So to end this segment, I want to talk about how there was a new vision for government that came to our city, partly because of the hippies, because of those who were anti-war and pro-peace and wanted a new kind of government. And so the location of the Summer of Love in 1967 was Haight and Ashbury, and that was an area where basically the hippies tried to establish their own community with their own way of dealing with things. And they had a clinic where people could get health care for free. And they had a lot of activism that I think has become a part of the identity of San Francisco over the years. So we can look at the firsts, and we can also look at how government is today, and the fact that San Francisco is an extremely diverse city with many different ideas and people coming together to try to solve problems. So we're going to try and race through some of the sites of the local geography of San Francisco. I won't be able to cover everything, and it's okay that we don't. I just want some of the names to become a part of your vocabulary. If you don't know some of these places, I encourage you to talk over the names with other people and maybe see them if you have time someday. San Francisco is built on hills. It's on the coast, and it's an area of seismic activity where faults meet. So obviously, you have these rolling hills, and these hills provide beautiful views and also strategically defensive places where the military can defend the country. Well, 7 hills are what make up San Francisco, and that's a little bit like Rome. Rome was built on 7 hills. I'm just going to talk about a few of them. Nob Hill, Russian Hill, Twin Peaks is considered to be one hill. You have Telegraph Hill, where Coit Tower is, and you have Mount Davidson, which is the site of a very special monument for us as Christians. It's a huge cross, and there was danger that cross might be removed because some people feel that it shouldn't be a symbol of a city where not everyone is Christian, but we can be grateful that cross is still on Mount Davidson as a historical landmark. In addition, you know that San Francisco is a peninsula, and it's a part of the San Francisco Bay. And so we have the East Bay, obviously, the part that is on the east side of San Francisco Bay, and then we have peninsula. We also have islands, and there are many islands, but we'll just talk about 4 of them. Angel Island was the entry point for immigrants, and it was an immigration station essentially, and many Chinese immigrants came through Angel Island. Alcatraz, the prison island that we can all see as we're going to Fisherman's Wharf, and Goat Island, which was eventually named Yerba Buena, Goat Island is actually a part of the Bay Bridge, and is a very important point where the bridge could be built without using more resources. And then you have Treasure Island, which is the result of building the bridge and the tunnel that goes under the bay. There was so much material from the digging of the tunnel that they could create this artificial treasure island. And, that's true for a lot of, the financial district was built on marshlands and basically was filled in. And so, San Francisco, the peninsula has grown because of human engineering. We also have just the other features of the bay in the peninsula. We need to know that the embarcadero, it comes from, the Latin Spanish word for embarkation, to get onto ships, and disembarkation is to get off of ships. And so it's a transition point. The embarcadero is where the ferry building is, and that is, has been a very important point where commerce has come into the city. Fisherman's Wharf, of course, is a bustling location where now it's very touristy, but it's always been important for the fishing industry. Ghirardelli Square. Ghirardelli was obviously a chocolate maker and one of the founders of the city, along with the Spreckels family. Maybe Alma Spreckels should get a lot of the credit that their family owned a sugar company, and basically she was known as the grandmother of San Francisco. And finally, you have Hyde Street Pier, which is where all the historical ships are, near Fisherman's Wharf. These are points of interest that hopefully we'll get to see some of them on field trips. Now, the landmarks of San Francisco, hopefully you know all these. Union Square, where there's a monument to Admiral Dewey, who helped to win the Spanish-American War. There's the old U.S. Mint, and that it basically survived the earthquake, and the gold was in its basement, or its vault, and that protected a lot of the wealth of San Francisco when there was the earthquake and fire. And you have several structures that were left over or inspired by the PPIE, the Pacific Panamanian International Exposition, which was a big part in 1915 to celebrate the Panama Canal and kind of the revival of San Francisco after the earthquake. And that includes the Legion of Honor and the Palace of Fine Arts. The Palace of Fine Arts is actually remaining from that exposition in the Marina District, and the Legion of Honor was created by the Spreckels family as a replica of one of the buildings at the PPIE. You also have the War Memorial Opera House, created in memorial of World War I, which we'll discuss a lot this year. You have Coit Tower, as I said, on Telegraph Hill. It's that tower that sits kind of overlooking the bay, and there were murals painted inside by Diego Rivera during the Depression era. The Works Progress Administration, which President FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, helped to sponsor to get people back to work during the Great Depression. And, maybe the most famous is a recent building. It's the Transamerica Pyramid, or Transamerica Tower, and that is one of the most famous landmarks in San Francisco. Now, San Francisco is known for the good, the bad, and the ugly, and it's also known for its international character. So you used to have an area in the early days of San Francisco called the Barbary Coast, and the Barbary Coast was an area of saloons and gambling and all kinds of stuff that people did for entertainment, but it was also a dangerous place, and there was a lot of crime and illegal activity. And the main thing is, one of those illegal activities was kidnapping drunk customers, and suddenly they would wake up on board a ship sailing to China. And so this kidnapping, basically so you could get a crew for your ships, that was called Shanghaiing, because those people were taken as sailors to Shanghai in China. North Beach developed as a largely Italian neighborhood, and Japantown obviously developed gradually over time, and Chinatown was an area that it was created very quickly at the beginning of San Francisco's history because of the gold rush, but it was destroyed completely during the San Francisco earthquake in 1906. And many people wanted to use this as an excuse to relocate and basically get rid of Chinese community. But because of the Chinese determination and courage, they basically rebuilt Chinatown where it was and were able to maintain their rights in this city and establish deeper roots. And we'll learn a little bit about the Paper Sons later on, those who they lost any proof of identity during the earthquake and fire, but that actually created a new beginning in some ways for them as well. Now we will discuss many of the explorers that came to this part of the world. We're going to go through a couple of lessons and talk about all the different explorers, but I just want to highlight a few. You should know Francis Drake, who was a member of basically Queen Elizabeth's army when England was fighting Spain back in the late 1500s. England and Spain were battling for control of the New World, and Francis Drake was a privateer. He was basically an official pirate for the government who attacked Spanish ships and also made his own fortune. He sailed around the world and stopped on the San Francisco, the peninsula where San Francisco is today. Portola was the first Spaniard to actually sight San Francisco, and so his name is throughout California. And de Anza in 1776 was the leader of the first expedition, Spanish expedition, as we've talked about, came to San Francisco, camped at Mountain Lake Park. Balboa is a name that we know because he crossed the isthmus, the little strip of land between Central and South America, and he discovered the Pacific Ocean. Didn't come to California and San Francisco, but the Pacific Ocean is such a part of our identity that we want to remember him. You also have Cabrillo. Cabrillo was basically the first explorer to go up the west coast of the United States today, but he missed San Francisco because of the fog. At least he didn't land there, probably thinking it was too dangerous to go where there was a lot of fog. But that's kind of his claim to fame. He was a Spanish explorer that passed San Francisco by. Now, the Spanish and the English weren't the only people who were exploring California and San Francisco. The Russians also came down. They came down all the way, across the Bering Strait and down from Alaska, and they had a settlement all the way into Northern California, a settlement called Fort Ross. And so it was only in the 1800s that Russia sold Alaska and relinquished their control of the west coast of North America. We also need to know about Junipero Serra, who was basically the father of the mission system in California. We know already the mission of San Francisco de Asís, or the Mission Dolores. The Mission Dolores is what we call it today, and it's in the Mission District of San Francisco. Serra is famous, and he had a mission himself to spread Christianity. We need to know, though, that, as we've said, There were skeletons in the closet for many of these early explorers, and he does get some responsibility and blame for enslaving some of the Native American peoples, as did Columbus. These are not the things that we often talk about when we learn about these people in school, but it's important that we see that everyone has to deal with the good and the bad choices that they make in life. Now, from 1846 to 1848, the United States fought Mexico for control of the southwest of the United States. And one of the leaders in the U.S. Navy was Commodore John D. Sloat. You should know that name is a street here in San Francisco. And Commodore Sloat gets credit for basically taking over San Francisco during that war. And later on, the USS Portsmouth docked in the bay, and sailors and leaders from that ship actually raised the flag in the Spanish Plaza, and that's why it's called Portsmouth Square. Before that time, though, there had actually been English people who had settled in San Francisco. William Henderson is a man that we should remember as being basically the first Englishman to have a settlement in San Francisco. It was extending what had been, Yerba, Buena, and that Spanish settlement, and settling a little bit beyond that. There were once the United States claimed San Francisco, there was an immigration of Mormon settlers. Several hundred Mormon settlers actually settled. They came in on the ship the Brooklyn, and they settled here. And so again, that's a part of the diversity of belief and the diversity of background of the people who settled in San Francisco. Some early merchants, some people that you need to know. You had Levi Strauss, who obviously invented those pants that we all love. The Spreckels family with their sugar company, Ghirardelli with his chocolate. And you also had a man named DeYoung. Now, this is a fascinating story. We've already mentioned the Spreckels family, and Joseph Spreckels was this towering business figure in San Francisco. Well, Michael DeYoung, M.H. DeYoung, was a newspaper man, and in fact, he became a newspaper man because of the Civil War. There were newspapers in the city of San Francisco. Some supported the Union, some supported the Confederacy during the Civil War. And basically, the pro-Confederate newspapers were sometimes attacked by mobs. And their equipment was taken out into the street. And basically, San Francisco was largely a Union stronghold and became, California was a state of the Union and a free state, not a slave state. And so after one of these riots, there was newspaper equipment from a Confederate newspaper in the street, and M.H. DeYoung went and he got it, and he started the San Francisco Chronicle. It later acquired that name. And in the Chronicle, he would publish articles, colorful articles. He wanted to sell newspapers. Well, one of those stories was about Mr. Spreckels, the sugar baron. And Mr. Spreckels didn't like what was written, and he actually shot Mr. DeYoung. Now, the crazy thing is that, the DeYoung Museum, we know because of its art and history here in San Francisco, well, that was actually joined together with a museum created by Alma Spreckels. And so the fine arts museums here in San Francisco include both names, the Spreckels name and the DeYoung name, even though they were pretty bitter rivals. Now, DeYoung actually survived that incident, and Spreckels pleaded in temporary insanity, and he was actually acquitted from the crime of violence that he had committed. And finally, I'm going to say this very briefly. We need to know that San Francisco is a city of connections. We know all about the various bridges, and we'll always see San Francisco as a city of bridges across the bay. But there are other connections that we need to understand. The railroad built across the Sierra Nevada. It was such an incredible achievement because those Sierra Nevada mountains were an absolute barrier. Maybe you know about the Donner Party, which tried to cross, first the Truckee River, which is the dividing line between Nevada and California, and then the Sierra Nevada, and they got stuck during the winter in the mountains, and as a result, they resorted to cannibalism because they had nothing else to eat. They ate people who had died, and that is a terrible, terrible reality. And we remember their suffering. We don't remember them as criminals. We remember them as part of this suffering of the early pioneers. San Francisco then has been considered the gateway to the East, and we mean the Eastern United States, but we also mean the East as in the Far East, China specifically. And once that transcontinental railroad was built, people in Chicago or New York, they realized that they now had a connection where their products could be taken to China, and they could also import many things from China and take them and sell them across the United States. So we'll talk further about that. And just know that the two famous bridges that we have were both built during the Depression era as a part of the Works Progress Administration. The Bay Bridge was actually completed 6 months before the Golden Gate Bridge in 1936. So hopefully these things have helped you understand our city a little bit more. And now we're going to move to more general concepts. Hang in there. There's lots of information, but it's all around us every day, and we just have to soak it up. This unit will be called evolution, and some people say evolution. Within this course, you need to know that we're talking about change over time. And this change over time is something that we see happening. It changes people, and it changes places. It can even change an entire nation. So we're going to be learning specifically about the United States and how the United States evolved from its founding, from the colonial period, and then the founding of the country in 1776. We're going to be jumping forward, and we're going to be talking about our own city, San Francisco, and we're going to be looking at how the country changed as the 1800s came to a close and the 1900s began. Most of our year will be talking about the 20th century. So, where do we start? I want us to talk about some ideas, and these videos should only be about 5 minutes long, and I know that probably you'll get tired of watching much more. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the concept of colonialism. Colonialism is connected to what you've been learning about. We've been talking about exploration, explorers, and founding colonies. Colonialism is something that happens at different times in different places. A colony is usually a possession of another country. And so if there are people living in that colony, very often they feel that they are being controlled by someone far away. Colonialism was especially important beginning in the 1400s. We need to know about several golden centuries of exploration. The 1400s, and I'll call it the 15th century. The 15th century was the golden age for Portugal. They were the country that started exploration first. The 16th century was the century of Spain, the golden century of Spain. The 17th century, we could say, belonged to the Dutch. The 18th century was split, but let's say it belonged to the French. but it didn't last very long. There's a very important war that you need to know about, which was the 7 Years' War. It was a war between Britain and France, and a lot of it was fought in their colonies, specifically in the New World. And as a result, because Britain won that war, Britain took over a lot of France's territories, and that included India. So the 1800s were basically the century of Britain, and the 1900s, we would say, is the American century. And with that background, you need to know that colonies are an important part of nation building. When a nation wants to grow stronger, they look for other territories. Why? Because they want raw materials. They want to spread their civilization and influence other people in what they say would be positive ways. Often that means spreading their religion, including Christianity. They also want to defend against other countries that might be hostile to them. And so colonies form a kind of line of first defense. There are other reasons, but those are the main ones. A second term, imperialism, is very similar to colonialism, but it's a different side of it. It has to do with the empire that is being built, and it is speaking about a country that is starting to move beyond its own borders to have more control over other people. We talk about a media empire where a corporation in one country might control newspapers in another country. And so, and that can even happen within the same country. So in different cities, one corporation controls newspapers in many different cities. So an empire means expanding beyond your borders. And that leads us to our third concept, expansionism. Expansionism wasn't something that everyone agreed on. If you were an expansionist, you believed that your country should expand, either to help other people or to take their resources. And so many countries were expanding from the 1400s and 1500s forward. The United States started late because it started only in 1776. And about 100 years later, they were looking to expand. So expansionism is the belief that we need to grow bigger and influence more people. The opposite of expansionism is isolationism. Isolation means wanting to be by yourself, alone. Now, as a person, that's not a really good idea. But as a country, it means focusing on what's important to us and our people. You hear this a lot in the news and in politics. People say, we should put America first. The problem with that is when they say that, they maybe mean the United States, but the United States isn't all of the Americas. We need to understand that we have a lot of opinions that influence our thinking and our actions. So isolationism meant let's keep to our own business and take care of our own house first, and not try and go and control other people in other places. Now, all of this is rolled together in our last term, nationalism. Nationalism started back in the late Middle Ages when France and England were becoming nations. Many countries in Europe, though, didn't become nations until the late 1800s, the 1870s. Italy and Germany are maybe the most significant that became nations at that time, but there are many others in Eastern Europe that didn't really understand themselves as a nation until after World War I or even after World War II, and we will talk about that more later. Nationalism means you care about who you are as a nation, and you get your identity from the place you live in and the people associated with that place. Now, there can be a nation that goes beyond borders. So if people travel to another country and maybe they live in that other country, they can still be a part of the nation that they came from. So if I'm an American and I travel to Taiwan, I can still feel that my national identity is as an American. In class, I'm going to be having you look at these 5 terms, trying to sort through them to understand how they were causes of America's growth and how they have been causes of growth throughout history. You can see some benefits from these terms, but you can also see some drawbacks and some terrible side effects or even just effects of those things. Thanks for watching. I hope this helps you complete your activities that you need to do in class. Please come and talk to me if something doesn't make sense. God bless you.